Hey everybody, it's Albert. Now, you might be wondering about the title of this video, When Crackpots Breed. Uh, the YouTube user Brain Alley recently sent me this video by another YouTube user who goes by the moniker South Somewhere. And the video is titled, Our History is Not What We Think. And she could only make it through 10 minutes of the video before she just couldn't take it anymore. I decided to at least go through 10 minutes of it with you. And maybe in the future I might go through more of it if I've got nothing better to do, which is, but I got to tell you, even watching the 10 minutes of this video was enough to make your eyes roll back in your head and various other things. This thing is out there. It's sort of like David Icke meets Jordan Maxwell meets Zeitgeist. It's kind of like, and apparently the person who made this video is a fan of the movie Thrive, if you're familiar with that, which is kind of like Zeitgeist on steroids. And also a lot of this video is based upon the work of someone named Drunvalo Melchizedek. Now, that isn't his real name, I'm sure. I don't think there's many people with a family named Melchizedek, trust me. Who is this New Age author who, among other things, basically was into the whole 2012 thing, and how everything was going to change because the sun was going to rise in the center in galactic center. Well, actually, the whole bit about the sun rising in the galactic center is only an optical illusion caused by the wobble in the Earth's axis. It actually isn't going to rise in galactic center for real for about 30 million years. But that's a sort of, but why get in the way of a good story, right? And that's not hardly the main point here. But let's just say the guy whose work this is based on is, well, a crackpot. And as I'm watching this movie, the thought just occurred to me, this is what happens when crackpots breed. It's the only way to describe it, So what I'm going to do is go through those 10 minutes of videos and interrupt it now and then to make snarky comments, but snarky comments full of actual factual data, which may put this whole thing into perspective for those who would like a grasp, some sort of connection with reality as they're watching this, just to sort of interrupt and go, what's really happened is this. So let's. And there's no way I can describe it, so you're going to have to see parts of it, and I'll try to break them up so you don't start hallucinating or something. So, but let's get to the movie.
Over the last few thousand years, we have warped our own history. Our stories of the past have been changed, altered, mistranslated, and completely been misunderstood as we rounded the curve on the precession of the equinox.
When watching a film of this sort, and the narrator brings up the precession of the equinoxes in 30 seconds, there's two things you really need to know. One is that the person who's saying this probably has no idea what he's talking about. And two, turn off the video. It's not worth it. But for sake of argument, we're going to actually endure and learn this lesson the hard way.
Modern views of our history account for many things, but completely dismiss many very important pieces in the puzzle. For example, the pyramids of Giza. There is no modern theory that accounts for how these could have been made.
The preceding statement could only be made by someone who's completely ignorant of Egyptology for the last 75 years. We actually have a pretty good idea how the pyramids were made. And it doesn't involve anything like space aliens or levitation or anything like that. Sorry to say. Well, see, part of the reason is we actually have excavations that were done where the people who built the pyramids, where the workers lived, and we know things from there. We know things from other Egyptian, the way that the pyramids were not the only big stones the Egyptians moved, and they showed how they did them elsewhere. So it's pretty obvious they were probably doing something along the same lines. And again, none of it involved some bizarre kind of technology, some advanced technology or anything like that. It actually involved lots of people, lots of hard work, and some really, really ingenious designs of things that were able to take advantage of the technology they had to the utmost degree. So give the Egyptians credit for being quite ingenious and quite brilliant, but they weren't. It wasn't anything involving advanced technology or magic, or sorry to say, and we actually do have a pretty good idea how it was built. So well, as we'll see, this isn't the only thing this guy gets wrong.
Individually, each block cannot be pulled even with 50 men pulling it, let alone drag it for hundreds of miles and then stack them on top of each other 450 feet in the air.
This is a case where the person who made this video was too lazy to bother researching in actual academic books on Egypt how the Egyptians might have done this, and was too stupid to figure out that they probably could have done it. And so because of his own inadequacies, he thinks the Egyptians were equally inadequate. That really wasn't the case. Well, first of all, I think even the average person with no training could figure out that, as the way it was illustrated there, you're not going to just sort of drag the stones along the way he was illustrating. In fact, the Egyptians moved things that were much heavier than those stones. Things like obelisks and things like that, which were immensely heavy. And they showed how they did it in some of their depictions, the paintings on the walls, and they had these giant sleds. In fact, we even have remains of one of those sleds that they would pull these things on, and they showing people putting things, some sort of liquid or something to help it glide along and things like that. And they also wouldn't have had to move it hundreds of miles. Actually, would have been less than a mile. You see, if you go to Giza Plateau, there's this quarry, less than a mile away. That's where almost all the stones used in the pyramids at Giza came from. Giza. There's a quarry right there. You can go look at it. Now, there were other stones, of course, that were imported, but they were brought down on the Nile. They were brought down on ships on the Nile, and then they were taken off, and they actually had canals running almost right up to the Giza Plateau, and then it was just the same way they would have taken it from the quarry there. It was about the same distance. So, we actually do have a good idea how they did this. And the other thing is, they didn't, the way he was trying to illustrate, lift it up in that little cartoon thing he has there. That wasn't the way it was done either. They actually had ramps. That's the way they built a number, because we know that's the way they built their other stuff, by building ramps up leading to the structures. So pretty much everything he said there was just completely bogus, but that's because of a combination of laziness and stupidity.
A precise way that even modern technology can't achieve, not to mention having it lined up precisely with both Orion's belt, a golden mean, and Fibonacci spiral, and be a primary nodal point of every sacred site on the planet.
Ah, yes, proving that a lot of ignorance went into this video. First of all, the idea of how to make an angle precise, really, not only could modern technology achieve angles, ancient technology could achieve angles. People are so shocked that they could make something on an angle, and they could measure angles. It really isn't that hard. It's been done for many thousands of years. People know how to make angles. They really do. Even perfect right angles, for example, just take pretty much a carpenter's square and knowing how to use these things. It really isn't that hard. As long as as long as you're very precise, as long as you're keeping. Look what the Greeks did with the illusions, and almost like an optical illusion of visual perfection with the Parthenon. They were able to do that, and nobody's saying that they used magic or space aliens or anything like that. I'm pretty sure that if basically, when you think about, say, medieval Europe, where 2/3 of the population were living in their own feces. And they were able to build the Gothic cathedrals. I'm pretty sure the Egyptians could manage an angle now and then. Um, as for the whole thing about Orion's belt, that was something started by another crackpot named Graham Hancock. Actually, it doesn't. You see, there's a few problems. One is, well, first of all, the idea that it would match up with Orion's. Well, if you look at Orion's belt, it's basically 3 stars that are almost in a row. Getting 3 things almost in a row isn't really that unusual. And in fact, if you look at them, it's actually wrong because it's almost like reverse image. It would be upside down if you were trying to match them in the sky. So they didn't actually match Orion's belt. They were reversed. And the angle was wrong for the one that's a little off-center. But if you actually check the terrain of Giza Plateau, there's a reason those pyramids were where they are. One is to not obstruct each other, and the other, and when you consider where the quarry is, they're in about the only place they could have been put. So there's actual topographical reasons the pyramids are where they are. That has to do with a combination of the terrain and the beliefs of the Egyptians and how certain things had to be pointing to a certain way and not be obstructed by anything else. And so it's not that hard to figure out if you actually cracked open a book now and then that wasn't written by a total crackpot.
And that's just one example. Our history is not what we think. Many things that we've been led to believe to be true simply is not. This has got to be the biggest. The field of archaeology recently saw some monumental discoveries that are rocking the foundation of what we think we know about ourselves.
Okay, I know I'm going to regret asking this, but what might those monumental discoveries be?
Many ancient cities such as Babylon, Erech, and Akkad that were written about in the Bible and other ancient texts were always thought to be myths because no one could prove they existed.
What? Is this guy seriously trying to convince us that anyone who would be considered a serious scholar ever doubted the existence of Babylon? This is one of the most attested to places in human history. It wasn't just in the Bible. It was a place that was known up from the time, from the most ancient times up to the time of the Romans. I mean, the Romans at one point were invading. Alexander the Great occupied Babylon. The Persians did. I mean, there were all sorts of records of Babylon and written up to late antiquity. Now, there was a period where they weren't exactly sure where some of these cities were. And Akkad, for example, was the capital of the Akkadian Empire. So, I mean, we knew these places existed. We didn't know exactly where they were sometimes, but we knew they existed, and one of the people were looking for them. Now, there were places and people, nations that were doubted because maybe they only appeared in one text, like the Hittites, for example, or Troy. For example, Troy is the classic example because it was only mentioned in Homer's mythology and nowhere else. And some people thought maybe it was a story that was made up, that this Trojan War never really happened. They just made up the place. Well, it turns out it really did exist, but there was a legitimate reason one could see. And at one point, some people, not all, hardly all, but some people doubted the existence of the Hittites, even though there was a little more evidence of that. But they were proven to exist as well. But no one doubted Babylon. I mean, seriously, it wasn't just in the Bible. I mean, it existed up until late antiquity, because, I mean, things like the Babylonian Talmud, guess where that was? Just take a guess. And when all those ancient travelers were talking about the wonders of the world and they kept mentioning the hanging gardens of Babylon, you kind of figure that they probably saw a garden somewhere, and that somewhere was some place called Babylon. Kind of, just a guess. So no one doubted that Babylon existed, and to even suggest it is pretty much ridiculous.
Then, one of them was found. This led to finding another, and then another. Inside one of these cities, archaeologists found thousands of cylindrical clay tablets hidden deep within the earth under this ancient city. The tablets were completely covered in text, written in cuneiform, and tell an ancient story that spans back over hundreds of thousands of years on this planet, describing the history of the Earth and the origins of the human race in great detail. Now, the first thing we all want to do is just say that they were making things up. They didn't know the history of Earth, and they were simply creating tales to explain where they came from.
While it is true that these tablets were found and that they contained creation stories, etc., and they contained the whole thing about vivid detail and hundreds of thousands of years, no. See, part of the problem, well, actually, there's two things you need to know about this person's knowledge of this material in the cuneiform tablets. One is he gets everything from Zecharia Sitchin. Second thing you need to know is Zecharia Sitchin was a fraud. Zecharia Sitchin was this guy who wrote a whole bunch of sensationalistic books called The 12th Planet. He's the one, basically, the whole Nibiru thing, the Planet X, and that was all Sitchin stuff. He wrote a bunch of sensationalistic books some decades ago that made all these wild claims about what these tablets said. Sitchin had no training in any of these languages, had no idea what they said. He probably just looked at pictures and made stuff up, like depictions of the cylinder seal, which he'd completely misinterpreted. We'll get more into this as we move along, but basically, this guy's entire source for all of this material was a fraud. And for those interested, there's a website, sitchiniswrong.com, by a guy named Michael Heiser, who actually is a professor in ancient Near Eastern languages and can read Sumerian and Akkadian and all these related languages. So I would suggest taking a look at his website, and you'll get a better idea of what I'm talking about there. Let's get to more of the video.
However, if this was true, how can we explain how they knew so many things about the universe that would seem impossible to know?
Again, I'll regret asking, but like what things?
Not only did the Dogons know all about the distant planets in the solar system...
Wait a minute. We're talking about these texts in cuneiform found in Sumeria and Babylon and places like that, and you're talking about the Dogon who actually live on another continent. And in fact, we didn't even come into contact with the Dogon until the modern era, so that has absolutely nothing to do with what we're discussing. And on top of all that, the Dogon didn't know the planets in the solar system, but of course, if you're getting your information from crackpots, well, it's not surprising.
But so did the Sumerians. They described them all in great detail in these Sumerian records.
No, they didn't. It's not in those records. Now, some of them are. For example, Mercury's in there. They speak about Mercury, the planet Mercury, and they'll speak about Venus, and they'll speak about Mars, and they'll speak about Jupiter, and they'll speak about Saturn. But that's not really surprising, since you can look up in the sky and see all those things with the naked eye. They're visible. I mean, you don't need a telescope or anything. You can, as long as you know where to look. I mean, they're there. So that's not terribly surprising. But they didn't mention any of the planets that you wouldn't be able to see without them. And now a lot of this is based, again, on Zecharia Sitchin, and who's a complete fraud. Now, Sitchin, one of his things was this thing called the cylinder seal, which was probably the most famous one. And you can see a picture of that on that Sitchin is Wrong website. I'm pretty sure it's there. Where basically there's this thing that he says this central thing is the sun, and all of these are the planets going around the sun, and he counts everything and decides there's an extra planet, and that must be Nibiru or something, which has nothing at all to do with anything. But what actually is going on is that thing in the middle isn't the sun, because the sun has a very distinctive symbol in their iconography, and it doesn't match it. It actually matches either a star or a god, or perhaps a god associated with a star, and the other things around it are like lesser stars or lesser spiritual beings, and all this and it probably has something to do with some sort of harvest god, because this cylinder seal is actually about an agricultural festival, but he doesn't tell you any of that, so that what it is probably paying homage to this particular god, and then you see the king there, and you see them bringing various parts of the harvest up, and so it has nothing to do with the planets or anything like that, but you'd have to, or anything astronomical. Actually has to do with the harvest festival, and it may be with dealing with particular stars the god was associated with, because maybe they rose at that time of year or something, but still, it nothing to do with the sun and the planets. I mean, it's just such an absurdity. But again, this is what happens when you depend on someone like Sitchin, who's a complete fraud.
They also knew about the precession of the equinox.
Actually, they didn't know about the precession of the equinoxes, or at least they didn't put it in any of their records. If they did know about it, they kept it to themselves, and they didn't bother writing it down, which seems odd considering they were really into this sort of thing and would have made note of that. But no, they didn't know about the precession of the equinoxes. The first record of anyone seeming to know about the precession of the equinoxes, it appears to have been discovered sometime in the 2nd century BC by Hipparchus. So that's pretty much it for that. And there's absolutely no evidence in any Babylonian record of anyone knowing about the precession of the equinoxes or Sumerian record. It just is not there. End of story.
That's a tough one for a historian to understand, because it takes over 2,000 years of continuous observation to actually learn that the Earth has a wobble.
First of all, it would not be that hard for historians to accept, because the premise is entirely false. The Sumerians didn't have knowledge of precession. But even if they had, it wouldn't have been that hard to accept, since historians accept that Hipparchus discovered it, and he didn't have 2,000 years of continuous observations. You see, what this person is doing is assuming that what you need is to see it shift from the area assigned to one astrological sign to the area assigned by another, to see that shift from, let's say, Aries to Pisces or something like that. The problem, of course, is that he's making an arbitrary assumption of astrological signs. In fact, the Sumerians didn't use the zodiacal signs. They didn't use the zodiac. They knew some of the constellations, but they did not use the zodiac, nor did the Babylonians. The zodiac develops as a concept, the idea of having this, the tracing the sun's path through the ecliptic. That develops as a concept somewhere around 500 BC, which is long after the Sumerians. The division of the sky into 12 equal parts for these constellations comes after that. So none of the basis for what he's presuming here or even around during the period of the Sumerians. More importantly, though, it doesn't take 2,000 years. It takes a century, enough where they would have a noticeable difference of, say, a degree, because they certainly could measure the night sky in degrees. They did it all the time by that period, and the 1 degree difference would have been 72 years of observation. So that's what it would have taken, and they certainly were capable of that once they started keeping detailed records, and that began with the Babylonians starting the whole idea of night diaries around 500 BC or so. And once you get a couple of centuries worth of observations, as would have been available, because it spread, this keeping of diaries spread elsewhere. And when Hipparchus went through, because he was theorizing some of these things, when he went through and checked the records, he was able to extrapolate from them how long it would take to make the entire loop, and how, so it's not that hard to figure out once you've got the detailed observations in place. And it doesn't take 2,000 years. It takes a century would be enough. So, and then you get to the whole bit about the wobble. Well, they wouldn't have thought of. Now, they would have noticed something was happening, but it had nothing to do with the wobble to them, because they're thinking in geocentric terms. What some actually thought was that as things were rotating, there was something moving the entire universe in the opposite direction. So they weren't thinking in terms of a wobble in the Earth's axis, because they were not thinking in geocentric terms. So basically, you're wrong on all counts.
The Sumerians had this information from day one of their civilization.
And once again, no, they didn't.
A man named Zacharias Sitchin spent a long time transcribing these texts and had put them all together in his books, but many others have also done the same, and the interpretations are always very similar.
You gotta love it, huh? Well, first of all, Zechariah Sitchin never bothered transcribing anything because he couldn't read the language. He had certainly had no training in it, and he's been challenged. He was challenged numerous times by Heiser and others. But he would never accept a challenge to debate or anything like that because, well, he knew he'd get exposed easily. Because when you deal with, and lots of people have transcribed these texts, by the way, and none of them match anything Sitchin said. Literally, Sitchin's stuff is just fantasy novels. There's no other way to say it. His transcriptions matches no academic transcription of any of the texts. Now, it's quite possible that other crackpots have done the same thing Sitchin did, but certainly no one who's actually qualified to read these languages have ever come up with anything equivalent to what Sitchin has come up with, and that should tell you something.
Not only that, but Thoth has also shared information about this with us, and his account matches the Sumerian records. Adamus and other channelings discuss it as well. If you see all of these records and sources, there is a huge connection between the stories.
In case you're wondering, the Thoth and Adonis are supposedly channeled spirits that whoever's channeling them is, saying this stuff. And more than likely, the person channeling them read some of Zechariah Sitchin's books and just spouted out the same nonsense, which matches nothing in any Sumerian records, since this person obviously doesn't know what's in the Sumerian records themselves, because the only information he's gotten is from Zechariah Sitchin's books, and Sitchin couldn't read the language, so that pretty much tells you all you need to know.
Now, this story spans back hundreds of thousands of years into our past. It talks about Tiamat and Nibiru.
Of course, the Tiamat and Nibiru that appear in this tale he's going to tell has zero connection to the Tiamat and Nibiru that appear in any text by the Sumerians or Akkadians. They just have no connection to each other. What he's going to tell is pretty much a fantasy novel that was probably given a basic form by Zechariah Sitchin and then embellished by various New Agers and occultists, and there is zero connection between the two. None.
The Nephilim, seeding the human race, Adam and Eve, and the children of Lemuria. This portion of the story is really interesting, but not the most crucial to know. We're not going to be covering this at this time.
Well, he's not going to talk about Lemuria, but I can't resist because it's such a great story. Now, I doubt the person who made this video is even aware of the story or aware of where the land of Lemuria, the idea, came from. But it's too rich to go without commenting on one. You see, back in the 19th century, the idea of Lemuria was actually taken seriously. Now, today, everyone knows the lost continent of Atlantis. Everyone knows this idea. It's been in the in the popular culture for so long, everyone's aware of it. Not that many people are aware of the idea of this lost place called Lemuria, but this was actually taken seriously in the 19th century by various scientists. And what happened was it was also adopted by various occultists, the first one being Madame Blavatsky, who founded the Theosophical Society. And she decided that Lemuria was once inhabited by a race of 7-foot-tall, egg-laying, hermaphroditic ape men. I'm not making this up. I wish I were, but I'm not. And that they were sort of one of various root races of humanity, and they were basically they were kind of like the top race, so to speak, for a while, until they were eventually superseded by the race of Aryans from Atlantis. Now, the story he gives has the children of Lemuria being called to Atlantis to raise to the next level of consciousness, which sounds a lot nicer than a bunch of ape men being slaughtered by a Nordic super race. But that's the original version of the occult story. But you have to realize occultism in the 19th century was an entirely different animal than today, and a rather racist one at that, so we'll just leave it there. But what's interesting is where the whole idea of Lemuria came from. You see, it actually had to do with primates, with apes, or primates in general, actually. And there were these fossils they found of these various species of primates that were both in the Indian subcontinent and in the island of Madagascar off the coast of Africa, but not in Africa itself. And they couldn't figure out how could this have happened. And so they came up with, it seemed like a plausible theory at the time, which was that at one point there was a land bridge of some sort between the Indian subcontinent and the island of Madagascar, maybe a lost land that sunk over the century, millions of years or whatever, and that they crossed, that this was once part of the connected, and then it sunk, and it made sense. And so they called it, and the reason they called it Lemuria was because the descendant, one of the descendants of these primates, these fossilized primates, one of the descendants is today's lemur, Lemur, Lemuria. Get it? Well, it turns out that, one, when you go under in the water, there's no evidence of this thing ever existed, and two, you didn't need it once they developed the theory of plate tectonics, because Madagascar actually was once apart from Africa and connected to the Indian subcontinent. So there's no need for a Lemuria and the whole thing. So basically, you've got this occultic theory which has developed over a century to a much nicer one now, which is based on an actual scientific theory which has been disproven long ago. So there never was a Lemuria. But the name and the idea was stolen, changed, developed into something nicer and nicer. Now you got this nice, warm, fuzzy version, whereas before it had to do with Nordic Supermen and stuff like that, But that's the actual story of Lemuria.
We are, however, going to be picking up the story at the end of Lemuria, and discussing the events of Atlantis up to present day. What I'm going to tell you is a mix of what these records say, along with what Thoth has told us for some finer details. Please have your own experience while watching this. I'm not going to tell you that this is fact. I am simply saying, decide for yourself.
Yes, folks, I hate to tell you, but everything you've seen thus far is just a warm-up to the real video. Think about that. Now, at one point he talks about the things that are in the Sumerian records, and then he mentions Thoth. Well, of course, Thoth is just that channeled spirit, so where my opinion of that is. But the Sumerian records, take that part out and replace it by the nonsense that was published by Zechariah Sitchin that has absolutely nothing to do with what's really in the Sumerian records, and then you might have a more accurate statement. But now let's continue with the video.
There was a time, long ago, when humans existed at a very high level of consciousness. We were intradimensional, and were very psychic. We communicated through thought and emotion, much like how animals do rather than speaking or writing, which would seem very primitive. We lived primarily on a large string of islands called Lemuria, but there was a consciousness shift. We moved up in consciousness, and the islands of Lemuria sank beneath the oceans. At the time of this shift, a new continent rose out of the waters. We called it Atlantis.
As I was watching that, the only thing I could think of is, it would have been a lot more convenient if Atlantis had risen before Lemuria sank into the ocean. Maybe the Lemurians were really good swimmers. I'm not going to say anything on it because I think it's pretty obvious. But just for the record, I'm going to state that none of that appears in any Sumerian text. None of that appears in any Akkadian text. It's completely fabricated. So we'll just leave it there.
Back in the early 1900s, the spiritual path of the United States was similar to what's happening today. People began to learn about meditation and study ancient lands like Atlantis and Lemuria.
Yes, that would have been around the time of the Theosophical Society and Madame Blavatsky's 7-foot-tall, egg-laying hermaphroditic ape men from Lemuria. Somehow that didn't quite make it to this guy's story now, did it?
We actually found quite a bit of evidence that Lemuria existed, and it had to do with coral. See, the ocean floor does rise and fall. Coral can exist up to 150 feet under the surface of the water. In 1910, the surface of the ocean was probably higher because they were able to see coral rings heading away from Easter Islands for a great distance. These rings were estimated to be found at 1,800 feet, which means that for them to have existed, they would have had to be much higher and sunk slowly. Probably more important, they also found the exact same fauna and flora from the Hawaiian Islands all the way to the Easter Islands. This is a great distance, but if you look at a map, you'll see a long string. That string, according to Thoth, used to run along the western shores of Lemuria.
Of course, at this point, I would once more have to mention that Lemuria was originally theorized as a method of explaining the ancestors of lemurs appearing in both the Indian subcontinent and the island of Madagascar and nowhere else. And how did this happen? And they theorized a land bridge between the two, and now this guy's got us in the Hawaiian Islands somewhere. Uh, I mean, it just kind of shows you the absurdity of the whole thing. And I'm sorry, the fact that, yes, sea levels do rise and fall over long periods, but that doesn't mean there's a continent. You need a little more hard evidence than that.
That string, according to Thoth, used to run along the western shores of Lemuria. It is only on these islands that have the same flora and fauna. Same trees, bugs, bacteria, everything. Science can only explain this if there were closer land bridges between these islands at one point.
Of course, even if there were such a land bridge, that would give no evidence that that land bridge was ever called Lemuria, which after all is named after a primate in an entirely different part of the world, and the name Lemuria was originally devised as a name for a land bridge connecting that area in that part of the world, which is not the part of the world where he's putting Lemuria, and it was named after the name of a primate in a language that English that did not yet exist. So obviously there's a few flaws in this theory, and not only that, but even if for some other reason they just like the sound of the word Lemuria, that would give absolutely no evidence that any occupants of those islands or that series of islands, if they existed, were telepathic. So there's absolutely no evidence to anything he's saying. He's just sort of giving the illusion of evidence because, well, this is kind of giving the illusion of evidence is what crackpots do.
Although we were studying this at that time, World War I began soon after, and we lost interest in spirituality and the ancient lands for a very long time.
Actually, the real reason for the loss of interest was that a number of the occultists, the spiritualists, which was a big part of the that movement at the time, were exposed as complete and total frauds and con artists. Now, the one thing I will agree on is that there was a loss of interest for a long time. And it was long enough that everyone forgot what the whole Lemuria thing was about and just made up the story brand new, because obviously this person has no clue where the Lemuria story comes from, given the version that's appearing in this video.
After the sinking of Lemuria and the rising of Atlantis, at first the human race became scattered. We moved to various islands and continents all over the world because we didn't have a home. Yet. We didn't know where to go. At that time, there were about 1,000 humans at a very high consciousness, more than all of the rest. They were called the Nakals. Today, we know them as Ascended Masters.
You may have noticed he just sort of dropped in this mention of this group Nakal, just out of the blue, just no preparation. Kind of like you mentioned Lemuria earlier, with no preparation. Well, there's almost as interesting a backdrop story on this one as there is on Lemuria. You see, there's a pattern among crackpots. No way of putting it, to claim they can translate documents they actually can't read. Zechariah Sitchin being a classic example, of course. Sometimes, before anybody could read them, there were lots of people in the Renaissance, lots of crackpots in the Renaissance who claimed they could read the hieroglyphs. Once Champollion's work with the Rosetta Stone was finished, I proved that all of these were complete garbage. This continued, right up to today, and people are still doing it. Now, in the 1800s, nobody could read Mayan, but this one guy named Charles Etienne Brasseur de Bourbourg claimed he could, and had translated something called the Troano documents. Actually, real Mayan text, one of the few to survive, Troano. He claims he could translate it, and publish his translation. Now, it turns out that once people could figured out the language, that his translation had no connection with reality. It was completely bogus. He may have been sincere. I don't know. Some of these people were sincere. Some of them were sincerely insane. Some of them, I'm sure, were con artists. I can't say where this person fell in, but whatever he did, it had nothing to do with actually what was in the text. Now, in his translation, he mentions the lost continent of Mu, and if you've ever heard the idea of the lost continent of Mu, that's where it came from. Of course, crackpots being crackpots, they can't let it stop there. Other crackpots have to build on it and embellish the story, and so Augustus Laplangian then goes into this whole thing about Mu and how Mu evangelized the world, and how the high priests of Mu were called the Nakal, and then came up with these. What was his evidence for this? Well, he didn't really have any, but hey, he could tell a good story. And you couldn't stop there either. Other crackpots had to jump in on top of that one. See, but now Laplangian identified Mu with Atlantis, and he was the first one to claim the Mayans were actually refugees from Atlantis. But on top of that, then you had James Churchward jump in, and I think he put it in Mu in the Pacific Ocean, separate from Atlantis. But he not only claimed that the Nakal existed and Mu existed, but he claimed that when he went to India, that an Indian priest gave him access to the writings of the Nakal, and taught him the language, and that he translated it. Okay, so he's translating a language of a people, of the high priests of a people who were based on a mistranslation of a Mayan document. Basically, everything at every level is a complete fabrication. So that's where the Nakal, and then of course, crackpots being crackpots, then Madame Blavatsky jumps on that bandwagon with the Book of Zion, written in the language of Senzar from Atlantis, which was taught to her by the ascended masters, who then people would identify with the Nakal later. But Blavatsky jumps on that one. But of course, she's the same person who gave us the story about the 7-foot-tall egg-laying hermaphroditic ape men from Lemuria. So that probably doesn't come as that much of a surprise. But that's the backstory in Nakal. And we'll get more into it as we move along.
The Nakals began preparing Atlantis to be our new home. They projected their energies across the surface of the continent in the form of the Tree of Life, not with 10 circles, but with 12, an extra on top on the island of Udal, and an extra on the bottom in the water. There were 10 components on the mainland, and even though it extended over hundreds of miles on the surface, it was projected to the accuracy of a single atom. We chose to move to Atlantis because of the Kundalini. In humans, the Kundalini is often referred to as the energy serpent that runs up and down your spine. When activated, it provides an immense amount of energy through all of the chakras. The Earth itself also has a Kundalini because the Earth is alive, like an organism, running from the center of the planet to a specific place on the surface. Wherever the Kundalini resides, the people there become the spiritual leaders of the world. The Earth chose Atlantis to be the new energetic center of the planet.
Well, for that portion, I don't think I really have to say anything.
After Atlantis, the Kundalini moved to the mountains of Tibet, which is why the Buddhists were the leaders in pure spirituality for the last 13,000 years.
I think it's interesting that Tibetan Buddhists would be the spiritual leaders of the world for the last 13,000 years, when Buddhism has only existed in Tibet for the last 1,500 years. In fact, Buddhism doesn't go back 13,000 years. So, can we say ill-informed?
It was a very pure place. It moved again within the last 10 years, but that's a story for another time. If you want to read more, check out the book The Serpent of Light by Drunvalo Melchizedek.
Would this be the same Drunvalo Melchizedek who seems to think all these things changed because the sun rose in galactic center, when in fact that's an optical illusion caused by the wobble in the Earth's axis? The same thing that causes precession, and that the sun actually isn't in galactic center and won't be for another 30 million years. Is it that Drunvalo Melchizedek? Of course it is!
Suddenly, in a single day, the Nakals breathed life into the Tree of Life on the surface of Atlantis. This created vortexes of energy rotating out of each and every circle. Once the vortexes were established, the children of Lemuria began to be called forth. Millions upon millions of Lemurians who had settled all across the planet began to be pulled toward Atlantis. A great migration began. However, the Lemurian body of consciousness had only reached the age of 12 as a planetary consciousness. Because we were right-brained, we were a female species, like a 12-year-old girl. And some of our centers weren't working yet. They had worked with these energies, but only mastered 8 of the 10. Each migrating Lemurian was attracted to one of these 8 centers on Atlantis, depending on the nature of the individual. There, they settled and began to build cities. That left 2 vortexes with nobody using them, not a single person. These 2 vortexes were pulling life toward them, and in life, you can't have an empty place. life will find a way to fill it. Similar to if you were driving along a freeway following another car and you drop too far behind, someone will fill the place. That's exactly what happened on Atlantis. Though the Lemurians had only filled 8 of the vortex areas, Mayan records state clearly that there were 10 cities in Atlantis when it fell. You can see these records in the Troano document, which is now located in the British Museum.
Okay, look, I'm going to skip the whole part about the vortices and the 12-year-old girls and that kind of thing, because it's just not worth commenting on. Okay, but I want to concentrate on something you could actually verify, because he says you could go check this in the Troano document in the British Museum about the 10 cities in Atlantis. Well, first of all, there's nothing about 10 cities of Atlantis in the Troano document. The story he's giving, I'm sure, is an embellished version of a complete fraud that was perpetrated in 1912 by someone who claimed his name was Paul Schliemann. He said he was the grandson of Heinrich Schliemann, who was the discoverer of Troy. And he said he had gotten a secret, that his grandfather had gotten the secret information, these medallions or something in Troy that talked about Atlantis and gave the location, and he had discovered where Atlantis was. He had used this information to discover where Atlantis was, and he mentioned he looked at the Troano document in the British Museum and used that information with what else he had to discover the location of Atlantis, etc., etc. Well, the reason I say that it descended from the story, and by the way, this guy was a complete and total fraud. It's been exposed long ago, like a century ago, so it was obvious. And one of the reasons it was obvious is one of the reasons I say that this is an embellished version of that story, or at least it has some connection to that fraud. This fraud has a connection to that fraud because he talks about you can go check the Troano document in the British Museum. You see, the Troano document is not in the British Museum. It's never been in the British Museum. That's one of the things this guy said. He said he checked it. You can go look at it in the British Museum. Well, it's never been there. The Troano document is where it's been for centuries, which is the National Museum in Madrid, Spain. And by the way, and again, it has nothing in it about Atlantis, but the fact that this person's giving essentially the same kind of story, you can go check it in the Troano document in the British Museum, indicates to me that he's repeated something that's been embellished of something else, that it goes back to this fraud in 1912. So I think we know where this one stands. Okay, at this point I've gone through, say, 7 minutes and 10 seconds of this insanity. I know I was going to do the 10 minutes, but I decided to have mercy on you. Not to mention it's gotten, just the commentary has extended this considerably, and I don't really think I need to point how insane the whole thing is. In case you're really curious about those other two vortexes and what happens to those, well, they're occupied by two other groups. One is the Hebrews, who apparently are actually from another planet. In the future, they got sent back for remedial consciousness training. Apparently, that's according to this video, and the other group is the Martians. I'm not making this up. I'm really not. You can look at the next few minutes of the video. It's quite bizarre. As I'm sure the rest of it that I haven't seen is even more bizarre. But I decided to stop it here because I think I've given you enough background that you kind of see how well-founded all of this is, and that, okay, maybe our history isn't what we think, but it's certainly not what this guy thinks. So with that, thank you very much for your time.